I will turn it over to Dr. Farha Abbasi.
So thank you, everyone. It's personally a great honor for me to be presenting today. I remember it was a couple of years ago during one of the Muslim mental health conferences that Alhamdulillah is in 14th year now. But a couple of years ago, Professor Linda Sayed and I were on a panel for refugee mental health. And she was presenting on the Syrian refugees in south of Lebanon. And the whole panel theme somehow got to the point, like, how does this displacement impact the refugees? Or how, especially if you do not have citizenship. And that's where the word statelessness came up, and not belonging anywhere. We were talking about those themes. And then I saw an article that in next couple of years, we will have a whole generation of Muslim youth which will not have any citizenship to any country. And like we will have a whole generation that's going to be stateless. And that just stuck with me. And we, as a mental health provider, we are pain bearers. We track trauma, we take on trauma. So we hear these, we are in amidst this chaos which is happening around us. We kind of become we are in forefront of all this, what's happening around us, be it COVID-19, racism, or wars or displacement. But these words somehow stayed with me, that how does being stateless, how can somebody go beyond that? How does it impact one's life? How does it impact their growth trajectory? So this is where I'm so grateful that I could team up with Professor Linda Sayed and Professor Hourani, and of course, great leadership of Muhammad Khalil and amazing Mary Firdausi, who could bring it all together. So I want to focus on starting. So I did change my presentation a little bit from just focusing on mental health to, after listening to all the great presentations yesterday, one thing I realized that there was one common theme, right? One common theme was of pain, of undiscussed, untalked trauma, or disenfranchised grief. And it doesn't only impact the people that are living through it, it's permeating the society. It permeates our work as researchers, clinicians. All of us want to stay in the line of being clinician and care providers, but we are also wanting to advocate. And the passion of the presenters yesterday, it is like, you realize like how enormous this issue is, and is going to continue to be. On one hand, and especially seeing the news yesterday and seeing another set of people in Ukraine running, fleeing, trying to get into Poland. So world is a very volatile place right now. And this is gonna just continue, right? This issues are gonna continue and the resources are gonna shrink. So we really have to think outside the box, that how can we sustain and maintain this work and continue to support this vulnerable population? With that, I'll share my presentation. It's a very brief presentation. Um, So, like I said, yesterday's presentations, how it impacted me. I thought these were all narratives of pain, uh, of trauma, you know, a journey of the trauma. So I know there was some discussion that why I pick statelessness, and I wanted to give my perspective that why statelessness just stands out to me. A stateless person is someone who does not possess any nationality. The term nationality referring to the legal bond between a person and a state. But then there was this other, somewhere else I was reading, and this is a Supreme Court decision, but these words just stuck with me. Statelessness can be a form of punishment, more primitive than torture, for it destroys for the individual the political existence that was centuries in the development. So we have developed a system where having these citizenships to any country. So you have an emotional citizenship. You always are connected to the place you were born. You might be forcefully displaced or be a voluntary migrant, or you are in a state of asylum or refugee, but you do have that emotional state connection to a state. But we are talking about the legal impact of not having that legal bond and cover. So how does that impact you? It is a very important part of your identity. Like when we are traveling, we are always looking at the color of the passport, right? So it's just having that document, that freedom to move, to freedom, it just opens up so many choices. And that's the theme that we were constantly coming back to, how that's impacting or deepening this vulnerability. So UNHCR estimates that there are at least 10 million stateless people worldwide. And this is not those who have some kind of legal status, temporary citizenships or cards, some kind of a card or some kind of a work system they are in. These are purely people who have no citizenship. They can't identify themselves through a country. This figure expressly excludes the stateless Palestinians and the stateless refugees, because the problem is growing so rampantly that one thing I realized that throughout yesterday, I wanted to hold on to something, to hold on to some numbers, but then the complication of who's migrant, who is immigrant, who is refugee, who is asylum seeker or evacuee, the new term that we are hearing with the Afghan refugees or Afghan evacuees coming in. These all have a myriad of problems or vulnerabilities, or some might be having some benefits. So as many as out of every 3 stateless persons in the world, 1 out of every 3 stateless person in the world have been forcibly displaced. And this could be within their country. So they are internally displaced or forced to flee and are in some other states or country. So what I did was I took the different themes that I was hearing from the lectures yesterday, and I wanted to create a word cloud. And the words that really had an impact on me as a mental health provider, like Belonging Nowhere, Diaspora, Reclaiming Home and Humanity, Politics of Citizenship, Legal Regimes, and being No Space for Birth or No Space for Death. That really had a very strong impact. Displacement, stateless children, shadow children, grief, disenfranchised population, devalued, voiceless, invisible, belonging nowhere, without agency. These are learned helplessness and state of statelessness. These are all what constitutes a huge trauma. And when I created this, and I tried to do it multiple times, but it's amazing, really, the themes that really were impacting me as a provider, the concerns that I have as a researcher, or my work as an advocate, this is what I want to focus on, is the children. How is it impacting our future generations? These children who are displaced, these children who are living in these camps, what is their trauma? This sense of belonging nowhere, or wanted nowhere, or taken, not given a voice anywhere. The politics, how the politics and policies of vested interest taking over the value of these people, this statelessness. So, and when I see this, this is everything against what we talk about, the Maslow's hierarchical needs, right? And those are self-actualization, esteem. I'm sorry, it's not looking very clear. So esteem, belonging, love needs, safety needs, psychological needs. It's like literally all their needs, basic human needs for growth and development are being disrupted at every level of their growth. So how is this going to impact them? So these numbers really are very disconcerting, I would say. That 2021 has recorded new highs for the number of displaced people in the world, states an interim report by UN Refugee Agency, right? More than 84 million worldwide were either refugees, asylum seekers, or internally displaced. 84 million. Among the world's migrants are nearly 34 million are considered refugees and asylum seekers who have been forcibly displaced from their own countries. Half of them are children. I'll repeat, out of 34 million, at least half of them are children. And by a rough estimate, at least 13 million children are currently displaced. 13 million, 14 million, and the numbers are growing every day. I feel this is what is missing, right? This important age group that we really should be focusing on. And it just confirmed when I go through and look up the literature, the research, this is the generation facing acute deprivations in their access to school, healthcare, clean water, protective services. These children are among the most vulnerable populations on the globe. Tens of millions of children have migrated across borders or been forcibly displaced. But in so many cases, we don't have the information needed to keep them safe. We don't even have the data. There is no extensive compiled data that you can look up. You have to go in so many directions they bring in the bits and pieces and make sense of the colossal crisis that these children are going through. Between 2014 and 2018, more than 1,825 children, an average of almost one every day, were reported dead or missing. Abuse, violence, human trafficking. It's, again, an average of almost one every day. And mind you, this is the data that we were able to collect. And every research paper talks about that it's an estimated data, what they can kind of calculate by their limited resources. Many more such incidents go unrecorded. This is a grim reminder that children are among the most vulnerable group of migrants. The largest number of internally displaced children due to conflict are found in the Middle East and Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. The MENA region recorded over 12 million of internally displaced persons as a result of conflict and violence at the end of 2019. Almost all of them lived in just 3 countries, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. And out of them, 5 million were children. Undocumented, with no proof of their nationality, many Syrian refugees face a dangerous and uncertain future due to the risk of statelessness. Again, the themes, the narrative, that they are not, if you are not a citizen, if you don't have a legal document on you, then you are not a subject, you become an object. You are a mere object. You become the other, and other is always passive and receptive and lacks agency. The choices to the right to make your own choices, the executive functioning, you might have it, but you are not allowed to practice it. Invisibility, inability or refusal to recognize their actual existence, no voice, either in the sense of speaking or being heard, or in the sense of power. Learned helplessness. So we as mental health provider have always focused so much on learned helplessness. And this concept was given by Seligman and Meyer. And and they talk about that, they theorize that animals learned that outcomes were independent of their responses. So learned apathy, that nothing they did, this is what these children from day one are being ingrained in their minds. Then where does the resiliency comes from? How does the sustainability comes from? So this learned helplessness, the failure to escape shock induced by uncontrollable aversive events. This is, as a mental health provider, the ultimate insult, injury, that the depth of the trauma that continues to permeate every part of your life, from cognition, ability to learn, to retain, to lead, to make decisions, to have relationships. Research suggests that asylum seekers are 5 times more likely to have mental health needs than the general population, and more than 61% will experience serious mental distress. We saw in this latest research coming out that in Sweden, these children were having psychotic breakdowns, higher rate of schizophrenia, And of course, we next thing we know, it would be labeled that this population is more prone to psychosis. But the fact is, it's the level of trauma that every brain has a capacity to absorb certain aversive events. And this is just beyond what's happening. And these kids are breaking away from reality, are having breakdowns. And when I look at the policies, and we talked about different political regimes or how they are using this religion, culture to kind of project their own political agendas, right? But when I look at the policies, it's literally the world is using Band-Aid for a gaping wound. And I love this quotation. I myself am made entirely of flaws, stitched together with good intentions. But that's how I feel the policies for the refugee resettlement and rehabilitation. These are entirely made of flaws, stitched together with good intentions. And to summarize, are these the children of a lesser God or no God, with silenced past, unbreathing present, and a gaping empty future? Who plants them? No earth for their roots and no sky to grow into. Stateless, displaced, and unaccounted for, unheard, unseen, and maybe unborn. Thank you. And with this, I will go on to introduce my colleague, Dr. Reda. Dr. Reda is a leading expert in psychotraumatology and trauma-informed care, as well as mental health of Muslims, immigrants, and refugees, the Libyan Revolution, Arab Spring, and is the author of several books and a highly sought after dynamic public speaker. He received his master's degree from Harvard University in refugee and global mental health after completing medical school in Libya and while undergoing extensive training with the University of Tennessee. Dr. Omar Reda is now a board-certified psychiatrist practicing at the Providence Healthcare System. And mind you, it's 6 a.m. there. He's living in Portland, Oregon with his wife and 3 daughters. And Dr. Reda's passion for healing focuses on tackling the family dysfunction, youth vulnerability resulting from trauma. And he is the founder of Untangled and has a book, and I would highly recommend it. Dr. Reda, please.
Assalamu alaikum, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. It's such a great honor and pleasure. And hopefully we can have an interactive discussion about this topic, but this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And thank you for caring about this cause. And we know, unfortunately, trauma is not going anywhere. And Dr. Abbasi just, spoke very, very powerful words. But maybe in the near future, we will be hearing about Ukrainian refugees or, Taiwanese refugees. So very interesting times that we live in. So I thought maybe I will move towards another conflict given my background. I mainly worked in Libya and on the Syrian-Turkish border and on the Bangladesh-Burmese border. So most likely my focus will be on these 3 conflicts. But during my work in Libya, mainly in 2011, I created something called the Project Untangled. So I will introduce Untangled today as a model of care to try to break the cycle of dysfunction caused by the trauma that many people, not only refugees, go through, but with a focus on refugees. And we know that for refugees, leaving home is not really an option. It's not a choice that they do. It's rather a forced choice. And we can leave home. I left Libya in 1999. I was an asylum seeker in the United Kingdom. Found myself going from being an emergency room physician to boarding a boat and crossing the Mediterranean Sea and working as a dishwasher and working in a pizza shop. And eventually my asylum case was denied because the judge, he said, there is no evidence of physical torture on your body. And I told him, what you failed to see are the mental scars and the PTSD from leaving home. So leaving my home country was never a choice, and Libya never really left me. I continued to care about my home country, and I was very fortunate to go back in 2011 and be part of trying to heal all the destruction that's caused there. So as you can see, there's lots of pain and suffering because of the trauma story, but people try to hold into hope. You can see some of the roses looking towards the future with uncertainty, but also with optimism. And the trauma story many times is a huge elephant in the room that we tend to look away from. And we have seen very scandalous things happen to children. And today I want to focus also on children. Basically, seeing a child in the back of an ambulance, very shocked and doesn't know why. Basically, his home country is being bombed and destroyed. We have seen children, unfortunately, ended up drowning in the sea. And people will blame the mother. They say, how come you risk jumping into the water? And
I'm sorry, Dr. Reda, there is a comment that they are finding it hard to hear you. Can you increase the volume?
Okay.
Sorry.
It's 100%. So I will try to speak a little louder also.
Okay, thank you.
And we have seen children also drowning, as I said, unfortunately, because people risk their lives. And this is mainly not because parents are reckless, but because the water is more merciful than humans. People are fleeing imminent death. That's why they are leaving their home country. And we have seen many, many conflicts. We have children on the border here, and we have seen people in concentration camps during this time and age. We have seen Syrian children looking at the sky, not to watch fireworks, but rather because bombs are coming down on them. We have seen children from the Rohingya community coming back from school to find their villages completely burned down. So I know we can talk about trauma, but I thought today I focus on hope and beauty and joy. And I think my sister Hadia will focus on resilience also. And in 2019, I was very lucky to spend 10 days in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, and work with this beautiful community. So this is what life, this is what privacy, dignity, and safety look like at the Rohingya refugee camps. There are about 900,000 people living in these forgotten tents. So people are quite in bad situation. You can see these are the bathrooms that they use. Maybe 600 people share one bathroom. And this is the mosque that the whole village shares. It's nothing, it's just a tent with not even a carpet. So I see this not only as a humanitarian crisis, but also a moral failure. And as I said, you know, there are closer to 1 million people in the different countries next to Burma. There is people who are born in the refugee camps. These are stateless people, as Sister Farha had said. I have met a mother at age of 105 who lost 6 of her children. She had to see 6 of her children die in front of her. And there are no words to console this mom. There are children who have seen people on fire. They came from school to see their villages and their parents basically engulfed in fire. And these children, the war will continue in their minds. We have spoken with one survivor who saw 9 of his family members drown in the river in front of him. So for him, how to make meaning of his trauma story. And as I was working with one of the Australian nurses, and she said, Dr. Reda, how come the Rohingya refugees, they never smile? She said, I didn't see any of them smile. And this is what trauma does. It has the ability to steal people joy and render them voiceless and smileless. And we have hopefully the ability to try to bring back some joy, and I will share some tips on how to do that. So yes, Untangled started in Libya in 2011, but I have replicated the model with some of the villages between the Syrian and the Turkish border, mainly Mukhayyam Kallas, which was very, very close to Halab. But Project Untangled, very briefly, we go and do assessment of needs. So we contact people on the ground and see what are the current services, what are the gaps, what are the available resources, and try to be humble. We don't come across as arrogant or intrusive. And we just listen and try to be part of the solution. When we go there, we try to provide a psychosocial education to tackle stigma, provide training on the ground for the teams that are doing wonderful work. And we create safe spaces for the community, play and art therapy for children, resources that are culturally humble, and clinical services if needed. In the case of Cox's Bazar, I was very privileged to help them open the first library in the refugee camp. And you can see it's a very tiny library, maybe have 20 books or so. But this is what we did for a trauma-informed care training. This is our clinic and youth development center that we were conducting some of the play and art therapy activities. This is actually an orphanage. This is how the orphan children do. And this is how they sleep in Bangladesh. And this beautiful child who had Down syndrome is the only one who has access to every single tent in the camp. He brings lots of joy and smiles to everyone. He has the biggest personality. So we have heard from Sister Farha about belonging and agency. These are two words that people struggle with. And there is lots of stigma, as we know. So people come to the clinic very late in their suffering. They continue to feel that the world have ignored their cause. There are some post-resettlement challenges that we even see here in the United States, but I have seen it in other countries of resettlement. There is family breakdown. So the breakdown between family members is children go to public schools, they learn the language, and there is a power imbalance that comes into the house. Some of the parents, they might be afraid of the new culture. We have seen children who have identity confusion issues, and of course, not to forget Islamophobia. So I have seen good things also. People lean on their family and community for support. They are much closer to their religion, and children are extremely resilient. So things that I was able to provide for the communities there are a number of my books. One on the shoulders of the Prophet, how the Prophet ﷺ was a very safe role model, especially for the young companions. They came and they climbed on his shoulders. And they said, if children don't have a safe role model, maybe they will try to find belonging somewhere else. I've seen children who go into extremist ideologies and deviant groups. Liberated is the book that I wrote about the Libyan revolution, and Untangled is about how to break the cycle of trauma that happens in a family context. So examples that we have done, both here in Portland, Oregon, and also in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, parenting workshops, marriage seminars. And usually when we invite people to these spaces, we don't put like psychosocial support because nobody will come to that workshop. So this one, I called it, Will You Remarry Me? And basically, after I finished, I re-proposed to my wife. And she said, I have to think about this one. Well, I enjoy taking children on camps and retreats and do play and art therapy activities, even though I'm not a child psychiatrist, I'm an adult psychiatrist. But this is what I love the most. Whenever I have time off for a couple of weeks, I try to pick a refugee camp and fly there. So you can see the beauty of the children. There is some smiles despite the pain and suffering. This is Camp Sila. Sila is Arabic for connection. So we try to connect children to one another, to nature, to God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also to remind them to take care of themselves and look within and explore and discover their inner coping and their resilience. This is a clinic that we operated within with Med Global. And you can see these are orphans in Misrata, Libya, that I worked with. They still continue to have smiles and have some hope about the future. And not to forget those who are working to care for others. So I have a book that's going to be released in less than 3 weeks. It's called The Wounded Healer. So all of us are wounded healer. We do difficult work, and we need to tend to our own wounds and take care of our needs. And I'm very also excited to be the psychosocial consultant for this animated film that's going to be released very, very soon. It's actually been previewed right now in 20 cities in North America. One of them is Portland, Oregon. So I am very excited for Lamia's poem. This is a Syrian refugee child who found lots of healing, taking care of herself through the words of Rumi. So using art in order to heal herself and her family. And I do all of this because I am also a wounded healer. I was traumatized, not only because of the refugee experience, but also because I lost my sister for brain cancer in 1979. She was only 14, and she is the reason why I pursued medical school. I lost my nephew in 2014. He was killed by an extremist group in Benghazi. And I lost my mom, Allah yarhamha, in 2016 of Alzheimer. And she told me, Omar, you have to be a source of hope, and you have to try to make people feel better, leave people better than when you came to their lives. So inshallah, all of us, we try to be source of joy and delight and beacons of hope for everybody around us, starting with our small families. With that, I will stop, and barakallahu feekum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reda. Seeing you gives us hope that you have lived through this trauma and are providing care to those who are still in that process of healing. With that, I would like to introduce my next speaker, Hadia Zarzour. Hadia is owner and mental health therapist at Healing Zone. She's a licensed clinical professional counselor who came to the US in 2009 on a Fulbright scholarship to pursue her master's in community counseling at Loyola University. Since then, she has been working with refugees, immigrants, and underserved from all parts of the globe. She's certified in global refuge trauma from Harvard University. In 2012, Hadia co-founded Insan, an international nonprofit organization dedicated to providing psychological support to Syrian refugee children and adults in Syria's neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. She's also a co-founder of Syrian Community Network, a nonprofit organization that focuses on supporting the Syrian refugees in their resettlement in Chicagoland area. In 2017, Hadia joined the trauma training team at the Center for Children's Resilience of Lurie Children's Hospital. In 2019, Hadia led the trauma team responding to the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand and supporting survivors and their families. Hadia received her bachelor's degree in psychology and her master's degree in education from Damascus University, Syria, after which she spent 4 years teaching psychology at Arab International University in Damascus. And Hadia.
Thank you so much for having me. I think I'm muted. Can you hear me? Good morning.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah. We can hear you.
Yeah, it's an honor to speak here beside you, both Dr. Abbasi and Dr. Reda. I would like to, I'm trying to share my presentation. For some reason, I'm having some difficulty. I don't think you see that. Do you see?
Yeah, yeah. It's
Okay.
You just have to start the slideshow.
Okay. You see it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my journey starts here from this place in 2010 when I worked at, I was an intern at a place called Asian Human Services, the most diverse place that I've seen so far in the US. To my knowledge, we had staff from over 15 different countries, and we had refugees from different backgrounds, more than the diverse staff that we had. I was an intern there in 2010. I wasn't very pleased with my experience because I thought I wouldn't be acquiring the skills that I need to go back home and to practice therapy as an educational institution. It turned out that that place was the best thing that happened to me, as I worked with people from different backgrounds, refugees and undocumented, different legal status. In 2011, just a year after that, I graduated and the revolution happened in Syria, and it was this like very difficult decision whether to stay here or to go back home. The State Department at that time told us that we're gonna just find any job and we're gonna change your status and you can stay in Chicago. So my whole life it changed after that, and this is a very significant turning point in my, I would say, in my practice. As you see below is the picture of Vietnamese refugees who came to the U.S., escaped to Thailand, and then came to Boston in the 70s. I had many Vietnamese clients at Asian Human Services, and they used to talk to me about their experience and how they left home. And honestly, I just felt like as if it was a fairy tale. I thought that I was empathic enough or caring enough, but that was an eye-opening experience that I thought I didn't really feel their pain until I had the same exact picture. If we look at the Syrian refugees trying to escape and drown in the oceans and going from Turkey to Greece. So that made me focus on my, I was shocked by my ignorance, and that shaped and affected my experience later on as a clinician. Many people were supportive throughout the way. Dr. Stan McCracken and Dr. Mary Bunn of University of Chicago, they taught me a lot about trauma. And when and Dr. McCracken specifically, whom I met at Asian Human Services, introduced the concept of post-traumatic growth to me. That was in 2012, as I always expressed to him this pain that I had for being away from my country and not knowing, feeling this guilt of like going back home or staying in Chicago. And at that time also, I was confused about different terminology that we hear. I was blessed, as I said, to be at Asian Human Services to be introduced to many terms like, what is the difference between migrant, immigrant, undocumented, DACA, or asylum seeker. I remember when I was an intern in 2010, I had a client who kept, he was a priest who was tortured in Ethiopia, and he came here on like seeking asylum, and he kept telling me for 6 months, I need a lawyer. I thought back then as an intern that I was, I wanted to hear his trauma story. Why isn't he telling me his story? And my supervisor kept telling me, no, focus on what he needs. And as you said, Dr. Abbasi, speaking of Maslow hierarchy of needs, that he needed a status. He didn't have, his case was pending. So for 6 months, he would come to me and say, I need a lawyer. I ended up finding him a pro bono lawyer. And I remember that day when we were downtown Chicago going out of the lawyer's office, and he looked at the card of the lawyer and he said, now I can look at I can look at people in the eye, and I'm not scared of being detained and deported. That was another significant experience that affected me, and I started learning about the differences between different legal status. Many studies that I looked through that talked about the idea of legality and how that affects the well-being of the individuals. There's this amazing work that I came across, the Dr. Roberto Gonzalez of Harvard University. He had a comprehensive work with undocumented youth, and he talked about how that affected their resilience. So in his book, he mentioned many concepts actually that also connects to the experience of the Syrian refugees and many other refugees that I worked with when it comes to status, the idea of stigma and change social patterns, and to kind of I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's sad at the same time that now when Syrians even meet each other, the first question that they ask is like, what kind of papers do you have? And that's unfortunately sometimes affect the social circles that they can get into till this minute. So even if you are in the US, they would ask you like, is it TPS, is it asylum, or are you a refugee? And also affects their marriage also choices. So people will be like, I don't want to, marry this person with this who doesn't have like a citizenship or a green card, which speaks to the stigma and speaks to the kind of like different kind of racism that we might continue to have. Also connected to that is yesterday many presentations talked about the blocked access to healthcare, to schools, to labor, and how all of that will affect the psychological well-being of this despair, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Dr. Gonzalez also talks about how not every moment is conditioned by the legal status, and I see this very clearly with refugees, how they tend to develop a strong sense of attachment and belonging, and especially with faith communities, neighbors, and employers. So because of this background and I wanted to I witnessed this firsthand, the stigma of like, what are you? Even when people tell me with pity, are you a refugee? And I had kind of like to defend myself and say, no, I'm not. I'm a Fulbright scholar. And I kept like kind of struggling with this, like, why am I not saying, what is it to me? And even when I, it made me think of how people perceived refugees and how I perceived refugees, and how this kind of like feeling sorry for them. So I decided to become an advocate and to speak about the refugees and the how courageous they are and how resilient they are, and their roles in building communities. Yesterday, many presentations talked about the differences again between like where you are, where you manage to flee to, and how that affects your status and therefore your employment in school and healthcare. If we compare the situation to the US, of course, we're very blessed, although I would say it's very embarrassing that we only have about 18,000 Syrian refugees in the US compared to Ontario alone that has over like 20,000 Syrian refugees. So when we think about the U.S., and like most of my experience with refugees has been with the Syrians here in the U.S. 2 months ago, we had this courageous woman, Rehab, who became a citizen, and who, when I asked her about what keeps her going, what makes her strong. She said, like, I'm thankful for my parents and the way they raised me to have strong personality and never give up. I have 2 children and I have to be strong for them. Allah created us to build this life, and we have to remember that challenges will be there, whether there is war or there isn't. We have to have patience to overcome them. Rehab is married to a doctor who was detained, Dr. Firas Jawish, who was detained he was a cardiologist, detained in Syria for helping people who were in areas that were opposing the regime. So he was detained and tortured for 2 months. He came through UNHCR. He came here as a refugee, and actually he started almost from zero. He took the tests and he worked different jobs, and now he just was granted the residency in New York. Very courageous human being. And he said the most important factors for resilience is believing in yourself, positive thinking, and never looking back, determination and setting goals, and adjusting plans as needed. So, you know, those experiences speak a lot to the research that I went over for the sake of this presentation. And so you know, I'm just going to mention some of the studies that I came across and the factors that are connected to resilience that they mentioned. We talked a lot about trauma and what's trauma and how it affects the way that people cope and their sense of control and connection to meaning. And from those concepts, actually, the more that we help people to get a sense of meaning and to connect, then we can help them to be more stronger and more resilient. Many studies talked about or defined resilience as the person's ability to successfully adapt to acute stress, trauma, or chronic forms of adversity, the positive capacity of people to cope with stress and life problems. It's this interactions between like person and environment, and it's always dynamic and not static. A study, one of the studies that I looked at focused about the having legal status and residence permit. This is in Netherlands. It was a sample of 16 individuals. They did qualitative interviews, and they focused on how this legal status and having only resident, not knowing having to wait to get the permit, and how that affected them in planning and progressing in their lives. One of the participants says, I can't say I'm Dutch because I don't have these papers, and I also don't feel Syrian anymore. I'm nothing. We see this a lot when, with people like kind of being in limbo and not knowing how to start or where to start and how to move forward. Also, the study talks about what influenced resilience. 4 strategies: acting autonomously, the fact that I see it a lot with Syrian refugees also, when they say, like, I feel like I'm responsible for my life and there's no one to help me, so I need to really keep being focused and keep moving forward. Performing in schools, and what kind of experiences the students have in school. So sometimes, even if they're going through very difficult circumstances, even if they don't have legal status, just the idea of having something that consistent helps youth be resilient and help them in other aspects of their life, because they get anchored by education, especially that they didn't have education in the neighboring countries before resettling in Europe. As I said, this is in the Netherlands. The other aspect was the perceiving support and peers from peers and parents, and of course this factor we see it across different studies in addition to participating in the new society. And here we can play a big role as advocates or as researchers or practitioners in how to find ways that we educate the bigger society about the refugee population and about their needs, and ways to connect and do projects together so they can feel connected to the new society. Another study that I looked at focused literature review focused on many factors. Also, they talked about the personal qualities. Many Syrians that I interviewed for, I ended up doing many informal interviews also for the sake of this presentation. I was very empowered by all what I read about resilience. So I kept asking many people around me about their resilience, and they talked about personal qualities and how they always felt optimistic, and they felt like that there is no other way. They have to keep moving forward. So focusing here also on this literature review about the belief in one's own inner strength to deal with life challenges, that having this positive attitude, that's a determination to cope and taking control. I have to be strong for my family and my children, and I have to keep moving forward. Religion was a huge factor that contributes to resilience. Also, it was seen across many studies that I looked at, and it offers structure, encouraged cognitive restructuring and acceptance of trauma, also cultivated a sense of control, and the rituals promoted integration in the broader community. As I mentioned before, like connecting them to faith communities help them to be more rooted in the new community that they're in. Also, refugees resigned themselves to the situation and believed fate was out of their hands and it's God's hands. I worked with a psychiatrist, his name is Iyad Khouri. He's a Syrian psychiatrist here in Syria, here in Chicago, and he used to go to Lebanon. He established a community mental health center in Lebanon. He worked with SAMS for some time, and he talked about, he has an article about, he called it Alhamd culture. He's a Christian Syrian psychiatrist, and he says, like, in our culture, whether Muslims or Christians, we have this idea that if something happens to you, if something good happens, you will thank Allah, and if something bad happens, then you get patient, you have to be patient, and you're rewarded in both ways. So he said that was significant from his practice, that I've seen how people right away, they would say Alhamdulillah for whatever happens, and that it could be worse. Another factor, as mentioned in the first study, of course, support of family, as I mentioned, and always also utilizing the ethnic community. We've seen in the US, in many cities, that refugees have been resettled in cities where there is bigger community. So here in Chicago, we have a huge Syrian community who's been here for 40 years, very well established, and that helped with supporting these newcomers, whether financially or socially. Some of the obstacles also in this review was of course, it goes without saying, the language barriers and how that will affect this communication and really in social interactions. Racism and discrimination is also huge. And I want to focus a little bit on labeling or the trauma stories. I mean, when I started, when I was like a new therapist at Asian Human Services, whenever I...
Two more minutes.
2 more? Okay. Oh, okay. So I will, so basically I will, so it's just the idea of like, what is story? What's your story? Being curious as a clinician about what your story is and not labeling right away or focusing only on the trauma is very important in resilience. So when we're talking to a person, we can empower them by asking them about what is the inner source of power that helped them to go through this journey. So with going to them from the idea of deficit framework versus abundance is very important. and cultural competency is very important also for therapists to help foster this resilience in the individuals. I will skip this. Also, knowing the social and political story behind why refugees became refugees is huge in promoting their resilience, because, and I see it a lot, like when I talk about people, the Syrian revolution versus what people think is a civil war. When you say it's a civil war, you're taking away from the honor of the sacrifices that people gave. So it's very important to ask them about their story and to learn about this, the story behind them becoming refugees. Social comparisons also was very important factor that I noticed in one of the studies, that people usually say we're better than others, and that's really helping them to move forward. As we said, like we have a lot of there is no single family who's not who's not scattered, and we always think about, okay, at least we're alive, at least we're not we didn't lose any family members. So it's really amazing to me to see this, how people always comparing. At least we're in the US, other people don't have legal status, so that also has been helping them. Very quickly, I will go over some of the resilient stories that we around us. Here we have two documentaries by two women. They were nominated for the Oscar in 2019 that talked about their experience, especially this Dr. Amani Bellor. She was helping people in an underground hospital. Another one, this gentleman is also, he was tortured, and then he escaped through like from country to country, Lebanon to Turkey, then he came here, and now he had got a scholarship at Stanford. Also, this man who's also was detained, Omar Reda, was also detained, and now he's speaking at the UN and speaking on behalf of the prisoners. This man, I know him in person also. He works as a researcher in Turkey now, and he was detained, and this is how he looked like after 2 years of being tortured. So I mean, many people that I interviewed, they talked about faith, and they talked about having moving forward and valuing education, and how their children kept them going, and actually how being here gave them this opportunity to prove themselves and to contribute, and they were surprised by what can they do, their potential, and how much they can give. This refugee child, and I'll just this refugee child also talked about her teacher who used to smile to her, and that kept her going in school, although she felt like a stranger. Also, we have some initiative like, you know, in SAN, this organization that I'm part of, we worked with over 30,000 people in Turkey and Lebanon, and also we were impressed by people's resilience and wanting to support others. Another initiative for education, and some initiatives here in Chicago, in schools, and the STRONG program that I presented on 2 years ago at the Muslim Mental Health Conference, and yes, and Syrian Community Network also working with Syrian refugees here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I was people, and I just felt like I just want to maybe do a whole project on resilience now.
Amen. Count me in.
So,
just before we open it up, thank you both we really need to have hope and hold on to some sense of agency, because as in this field, in this work that we are doing, we can kind of get impacted with the sense of helplessness as well, when you are not able to be there and take care of this population. I want to just quickly, because lot of us, even if we are purely researchers, are getting impacted. So I want to talk to you about Dr. Reda and you, Hadia, is the wounded healer, right? Like, what are you doing for taking care of yourself? And not because compassionate fatigue and burnout is a reality, is a very much big reality in our field. So how are you taking care of yourself? And we can start with you, Hadia, and then bring Dr. Reda if he's still there.
Well, that's a difficult question. I would say.
I know it's easy to be a preacher than practice it, right?
Yeah. So recently, I've been working with different populations. So I take some breaks every now and then. I'm not heavily working with refugees as before. But honestly, when I was doing those interviews just in the past few days, as I said, informal, just questions, I just felt like I have a lot of energy, and that this is really my calling. Now, I know this doesn't answer your question, but those people are very courageous and resilient, and you learn a lot from them. I would say my family is very supportive. Also, my having faith has been playing a big role of like, okay, we only need to move forward because this is life, and we have different challenges so that's for us. It was this painful war and displacement.
So gratitude.
Gratitude.
Dr. Reda?
Yeah, Barakallah Fik. I mean, I wrote the whole book to hopefully try to, bring attention to our needs and focus on self-care of the caregiver. So the book is actually divided into 4 chapters. One is about taking care of our body, and the other one's taking care of our psyche, any negative thoughts and self-loathing language. And the other one taking care of our heart through social connection, because we know human suffering, the best treatment for that is a human connection. We are capable of damaging each other, but also of healing one another. And the last one is taking care of our soul by having connection to a higher power. So in my case, I do 4 things for self-care. One is my faith, other one my family, and then gratitude and acts of service.
Thank you. And with that, I'll open up for comments, feedback, questions. Could you talk more about Dr. McCracken's idea on post-traumatic growth? Thank you. And I can open it up to both of you. Post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on that, but the idea of the ability of bouncing forward because of the trauma experience that the person goes through. So it becomes like as if this trauma, with support, of course, if there's no support, where we talked before about, the impact of trauma and all the disorders that people might develop. But when people have some support, this will help them to move forward, meaning they're becoming bigger than where they are, where they started, because they have this experience. So it becomes a tool for them. And they're growing through this experience of trauma, but that again with support.
Okay, Dr. Reda, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think I have not been as resilient if it was not for my trauma story. So I will never give up or change anything about what happened to me. And currently, I'm writing the most, dearest book to my heart, which is the trauma story of the beloved Prophet. So Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, Prophet Muhammad, he was extremely traumatized by many things. He was an orphan. He was, forced to leave his home country. He saw many people die in front of him, including his children, his wife, and so on. But he continued to be a wounded healer. He continued to be a source of healing for everybody around him. And it was because of his trauma story that he was resilient, and he was a source of resilience for everybody around him.
Nice.
Verily, with every hardship, there is ease. Right. So, Sabah?
Actually, I had a question about, a lot of you talked about resilience, but one of the questions I was curious about is, what does support look like if it doesn't align with your politics, right? So what I was sort of thinking about was the whole group of women, ISIS women and children, and yet you talk about agency, you talk about, right, but what if it doesn't align with your politics? How do you approach that? Because by giving them voice is problematic in sort of the larger sense, right? And so I'm wondering how you balance that.
And anyone can take that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful question, and we have seen, and there is lots of discussion about the work of Renee Brown when she talked about vulnerability, and now people are saying that can be very dangerous for people of color to speak up when things are not safe yet. So I agree with you. I mean, we need to establish safety before we can, have spaces for people to share their stories and eventually reach closure and healing. So it's a difficult topic, and we need to be very, very careful how to invite people to share their trauma stories. That's why my main focus when I speak to people and is not to focus on the details of the trauma story, but rather how did they cope, what they are doing in the here and now, how can we take care of their basic needs in the immediate future, and so on.
Yeah, and kind of to add to that, I mean, when we're supporting them, they're not necessarily going to speak about their experience right away. We're making it easy for them to feel this social connection, so they can be more comfortable in schools, more comfortable with connecting to, socially to other people, or at work, at school, at other spaces, before speaking up against those politics, if that makes sense.
And I would add to that, because I had a personal experience. I had a Libyan graduate student at MSU who passed out, became unconscious when he saw Gaddafi being pulled out of that cave and all that experience. And when he came to me, people were really surprised, like, is he a Gaddafi supporter? Why would he get so impacted by what happened to Gaddafi, without realizing that he was part of that Gaddafi tribe? And to him, he was on a scholarship through Gaddafi government. So this is like family, this is like political support. I think it's so imperative as a provider that when we talk about acceptance and being non-judgmental, that we are able to check our biases. We have to check our own political belief system. We have to focus on the person, on their trauma, on their story. And one thing I've learned, that with trauma-informed care, you'd never say what is wrong with you. You always focus on what wrong happened to you. And that change in narrative, that each one of them in their own story are also a victim and are suffering. And we have to focus on that piece. And of course, because we are mental health providers, it's easier for us to focus on that. Somebody going and doing research with a political, from a political lens, I think three things that we have to keep in mind when we are dealing with this vulnerable population is malfeasance, beneficence, and social justice. Those are the three integral parts. Do no harm, can we do more benefit, and continue to have a fair sense of social justice. So hopefully that answers your question. But thank you for that important question. Any other questions, comments? And actually, we are almost just 1 minute away. We have talked a lot about gratitude. So it's very interesting that the studies show that when you do an act of kindness, or you do something with good intentions, with the spirit of beneficence, right? That a lot of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, the good mood hormones, they release in your body. But even if you see someone else doing an act of kindness, the same reaction happens in your body. But even if you read about an act of kindness, the same thing happens to you. So I think as a provider, my last message is to care is to cure. And please continue to take care of those that you work with, those around you, and take care of yourself. Stay safe, stay sane. And thank you so much again for this amazing opportunity. Thank you all for the team, Muslim Studies, and all the amazing presenters and audiences today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abbasi, and thank you to the whole panel for very interesting presentations and conversation. We now have a short break, about a 14-minute break. So at 10:30, we'll return for the fifth panel, and it looks to be a very interesting panel as well. So I hope you'll stay with us. We'll be back in 14 minutes. Thank you so much.